Welcome to the 38th episode of A Change is a Chance. My name is Ryan Lowe, and my goal is to educate listeners, especially the youth, on the most polarizing issues in this world by interviewing different experts who can lead us into the charge for change. Today, American history is a fragile subject. We have gone from this singular and exclusive narrative, or what my family would call the white man's point of view, to the additions of different perspectives and contributions, all the way to the recent surge to reframe the narrative through the view of the oppressed. There are some who support this shift, some who want to mix of the three, and others who are completely resistant to any changes to these old textbooks. Nevertheless, this telling of our nation's history influences the way we think about our present, which, to say the least, has been tumultuous. But what if there was another story we could teach that would showcase the truth behind our founding fathers' values and reveal the inconsistencies between them and us? Professor Kermit Roosevelt III has an answer. Professor Roosevelt is a prominent constitutional law scholar at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. His recent book, The Nation That Never Was, Reconstructing America's Story, critically examines the traditional narrative of American history. Through this work, Professor Roosevelt challenges readers to rethink the origins of American identity, emphasizing the importance of equality and social justice as central to the nation's values. His scholarship continues to shape contemporary discussions on law, history, and civil rights. Plus, Professor Roosevelt is a guest commentator on MSNBC, and he has a huge fan in my dad. So I met Professor Roosevelt at the Penn Social Justice Research Academy, where he gave a lecture on the themes of his recent book and about this alternate American history narrative. So how are you doing today, Professor Roosevelt?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing good. It's good to see you again. You know, after your lecture at Penn, I was just like, I felt weird because it was something I never heard before and it completely blew my mind. And right after that lecture, my parents texted me, how was it? And that's what I responded. One word, mind blown.
Wow, that's so nice to hear. And I'm really glad to hear that your dad's a fan.
So during your lecture at Penn, and of course in your book, The Nation That Never Was, you explained this alternative narrative of US history that goes beyond both the whitewashed one and the more recent reframing of history found in ideas like the 1619 Project. This narrative also explains the shift in values we know today from those of founding America. So could you please explain this narrative and how it better accentuates the critical events of our history?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to try. So the basic idea is that we're telling ourselves a story about who we are and where our values come from and sort of whose shoes we stand in that's actually not true. And I'm going to talk a little bit now maybe about how it's not true, and then I'll get to why we tell it and why we shouldn't tell it, which are sort of the three parts of the argument that I make. So the story that we tell ourselves is America is a nation that's dedicated to equality and universal liberty, right? Liberty for all. And I think that's sort of true now, right? Those are the values that we say we believe in now. Of course, we don't always live up to them now, but they weren't the values of 1776. So we like to say, look back to the Declaration of Independence, look at that phrase, all men are created equal. There at the very beginning is our American ideal of equality. And it turns out, if you do the history, if you look at the context of the Declaration and how it was understood at the time, all men are created equal actually is not at all the broad moral principle that we take it to be now. It's not a statement about how the government should treat people, about how people should have equal rights under law. It's just a very shorthand invocation of the sort of Enlightenment social contract theory state of nature. And basically, what it's doing in the Declaration of Independence is it's rebutting the divine right of kings. So, to sort of state this briefly so that we can get on to more of a conversation, the Declaration of Independence does have this idea of rights, and rights that the government must respect, but it's limited to the insiders. So you can look at the political theory of the Declaration of Independence, which is the political theory of John Locke. And the idea there is the government owes some duties to the people who create it, right? People come together to form a government. It has to protect their rights. It doesn't have to treat them equally. Doesn't have to be a democracy. These are all ideas and values that we sort of pasted on later. And it doesn't mean that the government has to treat outsiders, people who are not part of the social contract, people who don't come together to form the government. It doesn't mean it has to treat outsiders in any particular way at all. It's perfectly consistent with the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence to enslave outsiders, right? So we think now, oh, the Declaration of Independence must be an anti-slavery document. It's not. It says two things. It says one thing about slavery, basically, which is, King George is inciting slave rebellions, and that's bad. And it also says King George is trying to make us into slaves. So the colonists don't want to be enslaved themselves, but it's okay for them to enslave other people. That's the philosophy of the Declaration. So then, sort of the big question is, when does America become an anti-slavery nation? Where does this ideal of equality come from? And it turns out, again, if you do the history, this is pretty well documented. It turns out abolitionists are the ones who start reading the Declaration of Independence differently. And they start doing this in like the 1820s and 1830s. And America becomes an anti-slavery nation, I would say, in 1868, because we're not anti-slavery until about 1863, when the Civil War changes from a war for union to a war for liberty. And we're not a nation until 1868, which is when the 14th Amendment is ratified and the whole structure of the national government changes, and we get a much stronger national government that actually is going to protect everyone's rights. That's what the 14th Amendment adds to the Constitution: equality, federally enforceable constitutional rights. So the idea that I have is, we take this American value of equality, we say it's from 1776 and the Revolution. It's not. It's from 1868 and the Civil War. And if we see that, we can tell a different story, where the people that we should look up to and honor and emulate aren't the patriots of 1776, who are, fighting war for their own independence, but relatively unconcerned about the injustices that they're inflicting on other people. Instead, our heroes are people like the soldiers of the Union Army, and maybe especially the black soldiers of the Union Army, who are fighting to bring freedom to others, who are fighting to make an America that doesn't exist yet. So it's a more inspiring story, I think, and it's also more inclusive, and you don't have the problems, I think, if you focus on Reconstruction. You don't have the problems that you get if you focus on the founding, which, just to put it very briefly, we say Thomas Jefferson stated our deepest ideals. Thomas Jefferson wrote the American Creed. Thomas Jefferson articulates what is the essence of America, but that's a guy who enslaved his own children. And it's a little hard, I think, to ask people to look at Thomas Jefferson and say, this is the embodiment of your American ideals. Whereas, you look at the heroes of Reconstruction, they're much better. So that would be people like Frederick Douglass, for instance, or, Abraham Lincoln, or Thaddeus Stevens, or Charles Sumner. It's a better group of people. It's a better story, I think, and it's also kind of more true. So that's
And,
the basic idea.
and despite what you're talking about all these role models, I know that your story is probably generally not like the primary story within education. So what would you say to people who may call it like too radical? So what would you say about that?
Well, it is kind of radical, I guess, right? Because it's asking you to think of a different set of people as the founding fathers. Um, so, like, one of the things that's going on now is sort of a fight over whether the founding fathers were good or the founding fathers were bad, and I'm trying to like take a different perspective on it and say, they were partly good, they were partly bad, but mostly they weren't your founding fathers, right? Your founding fathers are the people of the Reconstruction era. So that is radical. But interesting question. How long have we been talking about the founding fathers as the people of 1776, right? Washington, Hamilton, Madison, Adams, Jay, right? Those people. How long have they been our founding fathers? The answer is not forever. Um, Before about like the 1850s or 1840s, probably, when people talked about the founding fathers, a lot of the time, most of the time, actually, they meant the 17th century founders. They were talking about people like William Penn or William Bradford. And this idea of the founders of the 18th century as the founding fathers comes along, um, and it's advanced in large part by Abraham Lincoln, actually. So this idea, this sort of reorienting of our origin story, it's been done before. You know, the founding fathers we have now weren't the original founding fathers. So now I'm suggesting a different group. It is radical. It would probably take some time to make this change, but we could do it gradually. And actually, it's been done before.
Okay, so what you're saying is that because the story has been rewritten before, it can be done again, and this might benefit our society in terms of the arguments we have to.
Yeah, I think it would benefit our society in a bunch of ways. Um, One is the people who are saying that the founding fathers of 1776 were bad sort of have a point, right? Because slavery and white supremacy are very much a part of founding America. And slavery influences almost everything that goes on in the early years of our republic. And it doesn't make America look that great. So if you want an inspiring story, right, you would like to say America was born in a war for liberty. And people say that about the American Revolution. But as I said before, it's really only liberty for the insiders. And you might want to say America was born in a war against slavery, right? The war that ended slavery. And we really want to say that about the revolution. Like Gordon Wood, famous historian Gordon Wood, says slavery existed everywhere without substantial criticism until the American Revolution made it a problem for the world. But that's just really not true about the American Revolution. Tens of thousands of enslaved people gained their freedom because of the revolution, because the war allowed them to escape from their patriot enslavers. And then often they joined the British and fought against the American rebels. We would like to say that America was born in a war for liberty, a war that ended slavery. Well, actually, it was, right? That's the story I'm giving you, but it's the Civil War. So, one way of thinking about this is the Revolutionary War is like a slaveholders' rebellion. Slavery is legal in every American state in 1776. And in Britain, it's been partially banned. Slavery doesn't exist in England. Any enslaved person who sets foot in England is free. So you've got this nation that's partially banned slavery fighting a war against 13 rebellious colonies that all recognize it. What's the Civil War? It's a nation that's partially banned slavery. So, we've got free territories, we've got free states fighting a war against either 11 or 13, if you accept the Confederate claims to Missouri and Kentucky, rebellious states that all recognize slavery. But if we say that that's our origin war, then we're the anti-slavery side.
Yeah, and I feel like this retelling of it in terms of like inspiration is probably a great way to pitch it to American education, if that's what you want to do next.
Yeah, that's exactly what I want to do because I think that we're having a real problem telling the story of America in an inspiring way. I think that that's what a lot of the conflict is about now because you've got like the older generation that grew up with this story and it worked for them and they're like, come on, this is the greatness of America. We believe in equality. It's the Declaration of Independence, 1776. And then people are coming along now and saying, hey, 1776 doesn't look that great. Thomas Jefferson is not my hero. This is not an inspiring story. And there's no real way around that, I think, if you still have to focus on 1776 because Thomas Jefferson enslaved his own children. That's just a fact. So, if you want to tell an inspiring story and you want to say Americans believe in equality, we fought a war for liberty. We sacrificed lives, for the rights of other people. You can tell that story and it's very inspiring. You just have to shift it, 80 years forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in your book, you encourage a different way of thinking about this country, that we should continue to look at through this reconstructionist view, where we look ahead rather than what we had before. So, what are some specific ways you feel that we can make this happen as a nation?
Well, so mostly what I'm trying to do is talk to like high school students, because high school students are the ones who still have their minds open, um, and like high school teachers, and say, wouldn't it be interesting if we didn't focus quite as much on the founding and we talked more about Reconstruction and more about what happened to Reconstruction, the period following Reconstruction, which people call redemption, when Reconstruction was basically overthrown and the gains that we had made in terms of equality and universal liberty were pretty much taken away. Because that's a lesson. And I think like this is another way in which the story that I'm offering is better. So the standard story says America is born in 1776 and we're all dedicated to equality and America is a great nation. But there's also this original sin, right? And the original sin is slavery, and slavery has to be worked out somehow. But then we do that. And if that's the story that you're telling, then you might ask yourself, what do I have to do to be a good American and live up to American ideals? And the answer, I guess, is don't enslave people, which isn't a big ask nowadays. Um, you know, you might think as long as I'm not an active racist, then I'm doing my part in the American story and America always moves forward, right? Because that's sort of our narrative of progress. So you might think all I have to do is not be a bad individual and I'm doing my part for America. But if you tell the story that I'm talking about, then you say our origin is Reconstruction and America is dedicated to this idea of equality, but then we lose it. And the original sin is not slavery, right? Because slavery is gone. The original sin is the overthrow of Reconstruction. And why did that happen? It happened because there were some bad individual people doing bad things, which is consistent with our individualist focus, but also because good people or people who could have been good stood by and let it happen. And if that's the original sin, right, allowing Reconstruction to be overthrown, then the message of what you need to do to be a good American is different. It's saying, don't be a bystander. Don't let progress be undone because you're not willing to face the conflict that you would have to preserve it.
Yes, absolutely. And I feel like that idea is really becoming more and more prevalent in today's society, as seen in things like Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, where it's no longer about non-racism. It's really about fighting back. So it's great that you implement that into your story.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of exactly his point. Um, it's not enough to say, I'm not a racist, right? You have to be an anti-racist.
Yeah.
And progress comes through conflict. Like that's the other thing. This idea, and Martin Luther King Jr. talked about this too. The idea that progress is inevitable and the essence of America is good and it's inevitably going to sort of work itself pure. Um, that's not true, right? Progress really does come from conflict because power concedes nothing without a demand.
Yeah,
I think that's Frederick Douglass, actually. I think Frederick Douglass said that.
I couldn't tell you. So so let's talk about current events now. With the lopsided SCOTUS right now, is there anything you fear might happen that has not happened already in regards to your story or how we tell it, or really anything socially related?
Well, yeah. So I think about American history sort of um, in cycles of a contest between two ideologies that I talk about in the book. But you can think about it as like there's Reconstruction, there are moments of progress towards equality. And then there's what they called redemption. There's the backlash against Reconstruction and steps backwards. And this always happens, right? And people know this. The phenomenon of backlash is pretty well understood. So we have a lot of progress in Reconstruction, and then we lose almost all of it in the first redemption. And then, for almost 100 years, the 14th Amendment doesn't mean very much. The 15th Amendment means basically nothing in the South, right? Black people don't really have voting rights. And then the second Reconstruction, historians call it. The second Reconstruction is the Civil Rights Movement and the Warren Court. And we get more progress. And, that sort of peaks in the 60s, I guess, but you're sort of still in that era of progress towards equality, I think until about the 1980s, maybe, in the election of Ronald Reagan, which brings in what I think of as the second redemption, because it's a backlash to the second Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Movement. And since then, we've been in, a period of struggle, certainly, with some steps forward. But mostly we've been seeing the Supreme Court and the federal government, depending on which party is in control, trying to roll back the equality gains of the Second Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Movement. And the Supreme Court, with a 6-3 Republican supermajority, is doing that pretty actively now. So they really do seem to be trying to kind of undo Reconstruction. And you can see that in the way that they sometimes just sort of ignore constitutional provisions. So Section 3 of the 14th Amendment pretty clearly seemed to bar Donald Trump from holding the office of president because he participated in an insurrection. But the Supreme Court didn't have any interest in that. And then sort of more strikingly, I think they're actually using the 14th Amendment to prevent the states from trying to act to promote racial equality through things like affirmative action.
Ah,
So the Supreme Court is pretty hostile, I think.
yeah, totally. And where do you think this puts us for November?
Well, every election is important. Um, this is an important one. I think a second Trump term would be really bad.
Yeah.
Um, I think a lot of people think that, but then like there are tens of millions of people who support him. So, it's this struggle between different visions of America. Um, and I sort of hope that the truly egalitarian, inclusive one prevails.
So, in your conclusion of your book, you quoted Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And yeah, I have it here. Only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. And this goes back into what we were saying just now. Do you feel now that we are at a time that is threatening enough to our democracy where people are realizing the urgency to protect it?
Yes, I do. Um, so only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. I used to think that that was like just something that you said, to make people feel better. But again, if you look at our history, the truth is that progress comes from conflict. So when do we make advances towards racial equality? Um, After the Civil War, right? That's a big one. There's some before the Civil War. There's the abolitionist movement. It's very divisive, and there's a lot of violence. Reconstruction, incredibly violent. The Civil War, obviously, 750,000 Americans die. So that's the kind of moment that moves us towards equality, right? And then you get the backlash, and you get sort of the reimposition of a racial hierarchy. And if you've got like a stable hierarchy where dissent is suppressed because people know they'll be killed if they go against it, and like that's the point of the public spectacle of lynchings, right? You will die if you don't observe all of the rules of this racial hierarchy. Then it looks calm and peaceful, but it's actually a terribly unjust society. And again, what breaks that impasse and moves us forward is things like, and Martin Luther King talked about this, it's things like protest movements, which are divisive, and then the people who want to champion civility will say, hey, come on, America's essence is equality, and if you just wait, we'll get there. But you don't. Um, you know, progress comes from conflict. And I think that right now people are concerned enough, they're seeing sort of the danger. And we're getting a lot more discussion of pro-democracy reforms, which I'm a big fan of. So there are lots of ways that we could improve our democratic system. Um, and I hope, that we'll get some of those, like Supreme Court term limits, like the National Popular Vote Compact, um, like ranked choice voting.
Ooh.
That would help a lot.
I mean, I feel like all of this really, really does come down to the election in this fall. And where do you think we would be, or what do you think we could do if, let's say, it didn't go in our favor?
Well, we've had a hostile national government before. We've had a national government that's hostile to progressive values and racial equality. And I have sort of mixed feelings about a lot of the Constitution in terms of how well it works. But it does, set up these competing systems of dual sovereignty. So if the federal government is in the hands of your political opponents, then you look to the states. And, no matter what happens, they're going to be blue states, and the blue states can work together. The blue states actually have a majority of the population, and they have a majority of the gross national product. Um, and they have a majority of the content producers and culture creators. So there's actually a lot of economic power and cultural power in Blue America, and we can use that.
Yeah. And hopefully we can also use that before this election and make it so we don't have to get to that point.
Well, I'm waiting for Taylor Swift to endorse Kamala.
Yes, me too. Hoping to see her at the DNC, but there
I
was
know, I was too. I thought she was the surprise guest.
who ended up being the surprise guest. I remember reading about that. I didn't end up seeing anyone
Well, yeah,
big.
no, I don't think there wasn't anyone. Like, people were thinking it was Taylor, and then they were thinking it was Beyonce, but then I don't know. I think maybe it just didn't come off. Maybe it was supposed to be Taylor Swift.
Yeah, because everyone, I, there were things on threads about people with like the LED bands that she used at the Eras tour. So
Yeah.
he was talking, this is gonna be Taylor Swift, and it was not.
Well, maybe she's saving it for something even more special.
Hopefully. Okay, so finally, I want to take a moment and read a quote from your book. Okay, that right here. But what makes us American, our deepest ideal, is that we keep trying. The true America is not handed down from the past, but created anew by each generation, created a little better. And what we can give the future is the opportunity to get just a little closer than we did ourselves. That's the promise that makes us American. So, what advice do you have for us who make up the newer generations as we continue to learn, grow, and pursue our passions? What is our part in shaping this country's future?
Well, your part is to do better than we did, right? Do better than my generation. Um, because that is how I think about it. And, I think you can be optimistic about American history in a couple of ways. So one is if you look at it in 50-year increments, we do tend to move forward. The cycles that I talk about of Reconstruction and Redemption, they repeat themselves at almost 100-year intervals. It's sort of eerie, actually. So, 1868 is the 14th Amendment. 1868, go forward 100 years. 1968 is kind of the heart of the Civil Rights Movement, the Second Reconstruction. 1863 is the Gettysburg Address. 1963 is the March on Washington. Um, and then, 1876 is sort of the end of Reconstruction, the Compromise of 1877. And I would say it's not 1976 because that's Carter, but 1980, that's Reagan. So the other thing that I would say, um, and I'm supposed to, it's like tradition at the end of each constitutional law class, at the end, the last class of the year, I'm supposed to give a little speech. And I used to tell my students, like, wow, we've got a great Constitution and it served us well. And then I was like, well, the Constitution can be improved, and what you have to do is convince your fellow Americans to have good values, and the Constitution will reflect your values. But what I've been saying more recently is, if you think that the Constitution is so flawed that it can't deliver justice, then you can actually change it, because that's an American thing to do. It's very American to say, I have worked within the system for as long as I could, and it's not going to give me the results that I need. So I'm thinking outside the box. I'm going to do something different, because that's really the story of America. So the narrative that we usually tell ourselves is kind of like steady progress, or at least continuity. So we talk about the revolution, and then we're like, and then we had the Constitution, and then we just sort of gradually perfected it over time. And what I'm saying is, actually, if you look at American history with clear eyes, it's much more a story of failure and reinvention, where we work within the system for as long as we can, and then we're like, this isn't working, we're going to chuck it, and we're going to do something else. So we hang in there as colonies for as long as we can, and then we're like, monarchy, not working, we're getting rid of it. We get the Articles of Confederation. We work with those for as long as we can, and then we're like, this isn't working, we're breaking the whole thing, right? The Constitution is, in some sense, an act of treason because it overthrows the government created by the Articles of Confederation. It wipes out the Articles of Confederation in a way that's not permitted under the Articles. So it's kind of revolutionary. And then the same thing is true of Reconstruction. So this is sort of a long argument, and I talk about it in the book, but the Reconstruction Congress annihilates 10 former Confederate states in order to get the 14th Amendment ratified. So this is what Americans do. We have values, and we try to promote those values within the existing system. But if it doesn't work, the values come first. The values are the important things.
Yes. And it's this mentality that we really need to be pushing change. This idea that we should or we can uproot the system because the system is actually uprootable. And it's really great to hear you say that.
Yeah, don't underestimate your power for change.
Well, thank you so much for coming to talk with me today, Professor Roosevelt. It's really great to see and hear from you again.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you so much.
All right.